the TARDIS materialized against the side of a stainless steel building in a fairly wide city avenue. As such, its pulsing entrance was not as discreet as some landings. However, it raised only the odd glance of surprise from the few inhabitants scuttling to and fro nearby. Vadrag, for that was the city's name, was a major urban centre on the planet of Aquathi, home to the Alsheen. The Alsheen were a technologically advanced race. Vadrag, for example, boasted a sizable spaceport, and this, in part, might have accounted for the inhabitants' blasé attitude towards the TARDIS's appearance. Nevertheless, there also seemed to be a general level of preoccupation amongst those rushing past the machine. One door of the TARDIS opened, and through it strode the Doctor, followed by Romana.
Ah,
Romana said knowingly.
Aquathi and the Alsheen.
The Alsheen somehow managed to simultaneously own a distinctive, yet homogeneous appearance. They were vaguely human in proportions, but their limbs were far thinner and more tubular than any man's. The Alsheen's head was supported on a similarly spindly neck, and seemed precariously balanced, given their large size. Indeed, it was about the size and shape of a large pumpkin, an impression strengthened still further by their wide, deep-set eyes and broad mouth. Their skin was a mottled purple colour. Barring this colour difference, and given humans' unfortunate tendency towards unflattering racial descriptions and comparisons, a native of Earth might well think the species walking jack-o'-lanterns. And from their physical features alone, humans might struggle to distinguish individuals from each other, so subtle were the gradations in shade and patterning across their skin, or their variations in height, eyes, or any other features of note. However, Time Lords, well versed in the wonders of the universe, including its peoples, were utterly untroubled by such human failings. In addition, it was in their clothing that the Alsheen's distinctiveness shone through, being intensely individual in choice of colours, cuts, and combinations. They were indeed a visually vibrant culture.
I've always had a soft spot for the Alsheen.
Romana continued.
A very capable scientific species, and quite a peaceful one to boot. Do you know them, Doctor?
The Doctor gave a secret smile. I have had some interactions in the past, or the future, depending upon your point of view. Romana rolled her eyes, but a hint of a smile crept through.
Of course you have.
The Doctor then looked about, frowning. But I do not recall this current fetish for flags featuring in their architecture before, he said thoughtfully. Romana followed his gaze, looking up and down the street. The street followed the line of the city wall. This wall, as with most of the buildings of Vadrag, was built of shining stainless steel and was taller than most of the nearest buildings, being almost 6 stories high. Periodically, the wall was reinforced with towers of that same material, reaching up at least as high as the wall itself again. Only a few buildings within the city proper rivaled their height. It was with these towers and taller buildings that some of the incongruities with the Time Lord's expectations began to appear. Of the towers visible, only one appeared to have received recent maintenance and cleaning, at least above the height of the top of the city wall. The others looked more streaked with dirt and droppings from flying Aquathian fauna, and here and there they even had the odd broken window. This same state of disrepair was shared by the taller buildings within Vadrag itself, although again only above the height of the main city wall. The second oddity was at a lower level, and it was most obvious in the street around them. The Doctor's use of the word flags was a considerable understatement. Along each side of the street, attached to the buildings themselves as they rose, were vast sail-like stretches of cloth. They were supported at top and bottom by beams jutting out to halfway across the street, and this, coupled with their off-white colour, added to the impression of a city transformed into a yacht club. These sails were offset from each other from one side of the road to the opposite, leaving room for people and traffic to pass, although now forced to thread a zigzag course as they hurried along, casting the odd nervous glance skywards.
I see what you mean,
Romana agreed.
I also don't remember the Alsheen being in such a rush. They were always such a calm people.
Flags and fear, the Doctor mused, glancing upwards once more as a gust of wind could be heard blowing through the towers. Indeed, a touch of vertigo too, perhaps. Just then, as the Time Lord's eyes had wandered along the top of the wall, they were transfixed by the appearance of a figure. Appearance really was the only fitting description of how this entity had arrived, seeming to ripple or swirl into existence from nothing. and it was the stuff of nightmares. It was roughly humanoid, but not in the way the Alsheen were. True, its limbs were elongated and thinner than most Earthmen or Time Lords, but it had more obvious muscle and sinew than the Alsheen, albeit stringy and fibrous, like a well-cooked chicken. In keeping with this analogy, its skin was leathery and brown, pulled taut across those same gangly limbs, and also its face. That face was one of the most disturbing features of this creature, the tight leathery skin giving it an almost skeletal appearance, eyes popping forward with large bloodshot whites and tiny pupils. Its nose was virtually non-existent, a central line of cartilage separating two long nostrils almost flush with the face itself. Its mouth was wide and seemed fixed in either an insane grin or hate-filled grimace. It was hard to say. Finally, long, lank, greenish-grey hair sprouted from its head and fell past its shoulders, being blown clear from its face and naked body by the wind. This revealed two flattened and shriveled breasts hanging from its chest like two drained wine sacks. And the figure was as tall as the very tops of the towers. In 3 strides along the top of the wall, it had passed from where it had appeared, next to one tower, to reach the next one. Just as it seemed about to touch this second tower, it vanished in the same way it had appeared, like some sort of mirage or dispersing smoke. As this apparition had manifested, several of the passers-by had glanced up in fear before hurrying on. Anxious whispers could also be heard, indistinct save one word which gained prominence through repetition: Breshopep. Romana turned to the doctor, shuddering.
Doctor, what was that thing?
The doctor had still been staring towards the top of the now empty wall. He shook his head slowly. Something quite obviously not of the Alsheen. Indeed, I doubt very much it is of this world at all. Whatever it is, it does not bode well. At that moment, K9 trundled from the doors of the TARDIS around the 2 Time Lords and sat, staring out into the sail-bedecked street. The doctor looked down at him. K9, with the data already acquired, can you use the FDSS to locate the exact site of our local source event? Affirmative, Master. And once there, you can scan and acquire more data? And zero in on our quarry still further? K9 whirred. Naturally. Excellent, the doctor cried cheerfully. Then, K9, fetch! Upon receiving his orders, K9 drove off into the streets, lights flashing and antennae spinning, clearly on the hunt.
And what, Doctor, should we do?
Romana asked. Well, I suppose we should find out exactly what is happening in Vadreg. Usually I would ask a policeman. However, I think I remember where the Central Administration Building is. I may be able to pull some strings, if we're lucky. Romana raised an eyebrow.
Then pull away, Doctor. I just hope everything doesn't unravel in the process.
The doctor frowned, but could not entirely suppress a smile. O ye of little faith. As it happened, on this occasion the doctor's memory and sense of direction both held true. Vadreg's main administration building lay close to the city walls, on the opposite side of the street from the largest entrance to the city. This entrance was embedded in the base of yet another wall tower, one which still retained its glass in its upper levels, and, in this respect at least, seemed better maintained than the other tall buildings in the city. The administration building was clearly built to mirror the entrance tower, being of a height and style, minus the enormous entranceway for people and traffic to and from the city. Another difference between the administration building and the entrance tower lay in the former's state of disrepair to its higher levels, broken windows and grime shared with most other tall buildings in the city. The doctor sweet-talked his way past the entrance security with the aid of his psychic paper, allowing both he and Romana to stride purposefully around the building, attempting to appear to belong. This acceptance may have been facilitated by the Alsheen's familiarity with off-worlders, urbane and sophisticated technocrats as they were. However, the Time Lords were struck by the utter absence of any other non-Aquathians seen on their visit thus far. At last they found a large steel sliding door labelled Offices of the Chief Administrator. The doctor pressed a button and the door swept rapidly upwards with a swoosh, allowing them access to the room beyond. As the doctor and Romana entered, The doctor clapped his hands in delight as he saw the figure seated in the hover chair before them. "Radrag, my old friend, long time no see!" he cried. Radrag stood up from the chair and stared at the doctor. He was dressed in close-fitting white leggings and tunic trimmed with yellow buttons. At his waist he wore a patterned belt, reminiscent of tartan in design. About his shoulders he wore a three-quarter-length blue cloak, completing his outfit. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" In spite of a Time Lord's experience and keen perception, easily able to distinguish the features of an Alsheen one from another, interpreting their speech was an entirely different matter. The Alsheen's tone was so flat and featureless that the Doctor and Romana found no nuances or fluctuations on which to gauge Radrag's mood, only the words themselves. However, they surmised Radrag's demeanour was one of surprised, polite confusion. The Doctor laughed. "Ah, of course. I did not notice how young you are. You would not know me, yet." Radrag nodded his sizable head. "Time travellers, you must be. Are you Gallifreyan by any chance?"
Indeed, we are. Have you had many dealings with our race?
Romana asked. "I met 2 time travellers in a TARDIS a few years ago. They spurred my own interest in time travel, an ongoing research which I feel is on the verge of bearing fruit." 2 time travellers? The Doctor asked. Who were they? And why were they here? Radrag paused for a while. "What are your names?" he eventually asked.
I am Romana.
Romana supplied helpfully.
And your future friend here is the Doctor.
Radrag nodded. "I'm sorry if that seemed a little rude. It's just the other 2 travellers never gave their names. One, the most flamboyant of the 2, simply said, 'My name is not important,' whilst the other barely said a word during the entire time they were here." The Doctor stroked his chin. A pair of time travellers, with one far more loquacious and verbose than the other. What an unusual and unlikely pairing. If you do not have their names, could you at least describe their appearance? While Radrag's face was impossible to read, he shifted a little on his feet and ran his fingers together, slight signs of discomfort or embarrassment. "You must forgive me. My people find it hard to tell other humanoids apart. Your bodies are also lumpy. It is like a confused signal, like noise. As such, and it shames me to say this, you all look alike to me." The Doctor and Romana exchanged incredulous glances, looking each other up and down.
But surely,
Romana said,
you can tell differences in gender.
"Your species has gender," Radrag responded. "I had no idea." "Fine," the Doctor said. "Well, you must at least be able to tell something from their clothing." Radrag shook his head. "Not really. For example, you both seem fairly uniform to me, drab and darkly clothed. You must have noticed the vibrancy and variety in traditional Aquathi attire. To be fair, I could not reliably distinguish your garb from our previous, most helpful visitors. Who knows, maybe they were you from your futures." The Doctor grunted wordlessly at this. Then he changed tack. "You say they were helpful. How so?" Radrag sat back down in his chair wearily. "A few years ago, a plague came to us. The travellers helped us and gave us some respite from it, if not a cure."
We saw a strange figure walking your wall.
Romana interrupted.
Has your plague anything to do with that?
Radrag stared at her. "Brescio Pep," he said simply. At that moment, the door behind the Time Lords whooshed open, and in rushed another colourfully dressed Alsheen.
Chief Administrator, a caravan is approaching the city."
"The poor fools. Doctor, Romana, come with me, and I fear your questions will be answered. Why did they not obey the travel ban?" Radrag leapt to his feet as he said this, and darted past them towards the door. The Time Lords followed hastily in his wake. Together, Radrag, Romana, and the Doctor dashed downstairs, out of the administration building, and across to the tower straddling the nearest entrance to the city. Radrag led them to a door in its base, which turned out to be an elevator. This carried them rapidly up to the top floor. "This is the observation deck. Do not go beyond the tape." Radrag said before the doors opened. The lift shaft terminated in the middle of this floor, which was otherwise almost completely empty. Each wall was entirely lined with windows, allowing unobstructed views to all cardinal compass points. All these windows were intact and reasonably clean. Just beyond the lift, a length of tape had been hung, perhaps 2 meters from the lift doors, and some 6 meters from the nearest window. As they left the lift, the Doctor and Romana could see this temporary barrier extended around it in a rough square, preventing any access deeper into the room.
Our view of the surrounding lands are somewhat restricted, this far from the windows,
Romana noted. Radrag turned towards her. It will have to suffice if we want to live. Both the Time Lords stared at him in wonder, but he did not elaborate. Instead, he pointed towards the wall which faced away from the city and looked out onto the lands beyond. Vadrag lay on a wide plain between 2 shallow mountain ranges, perhaps 20 miles apart at the city, but spreading further in separation as one moved away, also diminishing in height as they went. The plain itself was covered in long green grass or reeds, which swayed gently whenever the breeze touched them. Through this living sea had been cut the main approach road to the city. Far away, other roads could be seen scything through the grass to join the main thoroughfare. Closer to the city, on the last half a kilometre of approach, tall poles as thick as tree trunks had been driven into either side of the road at regular intervals. From there, more of the vast sails and cloth baffles had been suspended, much like the flags or sails hung within the city itself. Look, Radrag said, pointing with more emphasis now. Just beyond the end of the cloth-covered approach to the city, the caravan could be seen. There were about a dozen vehicles about 500 meters from the start of that shrouded section, an odd array of hover cars, some covered, some open-topped, freight haulage floaters, and even some farm vehicles. The caravan was moving at the pace of the slowest of these, presumably to keep everyone together. They have almost made it, Radrag said quietly. At that moment a ripple ran across the plain. The wind had picked up, the Time Lords could hear it now, whistling past the tower, and it was this which had disturbed the grassland. With this wind, Radrag's body tensed. "Oh no," he said. Out on the plains, perhaps 100 yards from the caravan, a vast and terrifying figure swam into being. Brown and leathery, with tattered hair, naked wizened body, and hideous face, it strode towards the caravan, towering over them. Some of the vehicles swerved, trying to make some effort to avoid it, but it was on them in 2 strides, walking through the caravan and out the other side. As the horrifying vision passed, the vehicles then stopped moving, for the most part, while those passengers and drivers which could be seen appeared to slump, collapse, or fall from the vehicles. Then the wind died down, the giant vanished, and all was still. "What happened? What was that?" the Doctor asked, appalled. Silently, Radrag reached into his tunic and withdrew an object which looked for all the world like a jeweller's eyeglass. He passed it to the Doctor, who recognized it as a device more akin to a telescope. He placed it to his eye to get a closer look at the caravan. As the Doctor surveyed the scene, adjusting the magnification and focus, Radrag said one word. "Breshopep." By now the Doctor could see clearly the devastation upon the plain. Every figure visible had indeed collapsed into a pile of bones. Some bodies were still held together, more or less in shape, by their clothing, while others were more jumbles of cloth and bone. These were either piled or scattered where they fell. Alsheen bones were narrower and more cylindrical than their human counterparts, as befitted their different physique. Similarly, their skulls were larger and rounder, and many stared back at the Doctor now with empty sockets. It was as if they had died, then centuries passed in an instant, stripping the flesh from their exposed corpses. "By the Guardians," the Doctor muttered in hushed tones.
"What is it, Doctor?"
Romana asked.
"What can you see?"
The Doctor silently passed her the eyeglass. Romana gasped as she now saw the results of Breshopep's passage. "Now you see our plague," Radrag said. "Each time the wind is blowing, Breshopep, the butcher on the breeze, can appear whenever and wherever it pleases, as long as the air moves, at least outside." Romana removed the eyeglass and turned to Radreg.
And it kills? But how?
Radreg shook his head. It is unclear. My own research into time travel leads me to believe that there is some connection, the rapid degradation of the bodies you observed, but I, indeed no one, has yet determined what mechanism is at play. I am beginning to have my suspicions, the doctor muttered. Radreg and Romana turned to regard the doctor, but he remained silent. Then, finally, he turned away from the window and looked them both in the eyes alternately. The sails, flags and baffles, that is what the two time-travellers devised to help. They put up windbreaks. He asked of Radreg. Yes, it has helped keep our streets safe, allowed us to secure at least part of the approach to the city. But the upper reaches of Vadreg, the towers and the wall tops, they are still vulnerable.
Hence the safety barrier. This taped cordon here.
Romana asked. Radreg nodded his vast cranium once more. Breshopep's influence appears to extend quite some way, even into buildings, at least the distance you can see here. At great risk, we keep this one tower maintained for observation purposes, such as today's tragic encounter. The doctor looked about to speak, but then something caught his attention out of the corner of his eye. He spun around rapidly to stare out of the window. K9! He cried. Just beyond the white canvas of the covered road, trundling out onto the plain and towards the slaughtered caravan, could be seen the metal dog, very small but still identifiable. The doctor wheeled on Radreg. Where did your time-travelling helpers land? He yelled at the startled Alsheen. Just beyond the city, approximately where the caravan now is, perhaps a little closer. At that moment the sound of the breeze returned, singing past their tower. On the plains the grasses stirred once more, now swaying in the opposite direction to where they had earlier. Breshopep returned. It strode through the caravan once more, to no additional effect on both vehicles and passengers. K9, however, stopped dead in his tracks. The doctor snatched the eyeglass back from Romana and slapped it hurriedly to his eye. The doctor saw that K9 was utterly motionless, no lights flashing, no movement from his antennae. K9! The doctor gasped again, the eyeglass falling from his hand to clatter on the floor. He spun and ran back into the elevator, frantically pressing the button for the ground floor multiple times. Romana and Radreg had to dash back inside the lift to beat the doors as they closed, and together all three were rapidly transported to street level. As soon as the doors were open, the doctor hared out.
Doctor, wait!
Romana cried, running barely 2 feet behind the doctor. Radreg, taken a little by surprise, brought up the rear, noticeably further back. The doctor ran out of the city along the cloth-lined road. His passage was utterly unencumbered by people or traffic. No one was travelling abroad these days. The doctor could see the end of the covered section rapidly approaching, and beyond it the still figure of K9. The doctor was just about to pass the end of the sails and enter the plains when he felt a sizable blow to his back and waist. He fell forward, flat on his face, his arms spread wide. After a moment he managed to recover his wits and twisted his head round to discover his assailant. Romana lay over his legs with her arms wrapped around them. She had rugby tackled him. The doctor narrowed his eyes at her, frowning. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. Romana smiled a little sheepishly and shrugged.
Would you believe the playing fields of Eton?
Even the doctor could not fully suppress a smile. "I'm beginning to discover that with you I could believe almost anything." Then the doctor remembered his annoyance. "Why did you do that? I have to get to K9, to help him." Romana disentangled her arms from the doctor's legs and army-crawled up the road a little to lie next to him.
Because you were about to fling yourself into unnecessary danger. The wind could change at any moment.
Almost as if in answer to her words, a breeze kicked up and ruffled the canvas around them. For now, however, Breshopep did not appear. "But we have to see if K9 is harmed," the doctor insisted. Romana looked past the doctor towards K9, some 100 yards ahead of them.
Have you tried calling to him?
Well, of course. The doctor began before stopping and frowning in irritation. Then he also turned to K9. K9! Can you hear me? Are you all right? He shouted from his prone position. For a moment, nothing happened. Affirmative, Master. The doctor and Romana laughed and smiled to one another, clapping each other on the shoulders. Then each remembered they were meant to be annoyed with the other and returned their faces to carrying the hint of a scowl. The doctor once more gave his attention to his metal companion. K9! Why did you stop moving? Are you damaged? Negative, Master, K9 replied. I simply ceased scanning when the entity passed by. It caused multidimensional eddies. The worst kind, the doctor called back sympathetically. Affirmative, Master. They interrupted my ability to scan for the source event. The doctor stood up and offered a hand to Romana, who took it and allowed him to help her to her feet.
Have you located the source event?
She called. Affirmative, Mistress. I am currently at the site. The eddies are dispersing, Master, Mistress. I shall begin my detailed scans immediately. Very good, K9. Return to the TARDIS when they are complete, the doctor ordered. And don't dilly-dally along the way, was the doctor's somewhat curt parting shot. The two Time Lords turned and began to walk back towards the city gate. As they walked, they discussed what had just transpired.
You said you had suspicions about Breshopep before,
Romana began.
And just now K9 mentioned multidimensional eddies. Are we dealing with an entity of the bulk?
The doctor nodded. Yes, undoubtedly. But we, or at least I, have had multiple encounters with creatures of the bulk. It is not this alone which has so perturbed me.
How so?
Romana asked. The first encounter I had was a protrusion of a bulk entity into our realm in Sarah Jane's attic, the one which killed Clyde. But this may very well have been a chance encounter, as thoughtless as you or I crushing an ant.
Still a chilling image,
Romana interjected. No doubt, the doctor agreed with a raise of his eyebrows, but I haven't finished yet. With these words hanging in the air ominously, the doctor went on. Next we had those bulk creatures who piggybacked inside other lower-order organisms, the rats on Mondas and the penguins in Antarctica. But the bulk creatures in that instance were themselves some lower-order entity, the rats or birds or ants even, of the 11-dimensional realm. When compared with the vastness and insane complexity of the most godlike multidimensional denizens, as glimpsed in the attic encounter, I mean. Romana nodded.
I see. But in what way do you think Breshopep differs from these interactions?
The doctor turned to face Romana. I think Breshopep is some kind of projection of one of these higher-order bulk entities into our four-dimensional fragment. I suspect that as the fragments of our space-time begin to dissolve into the bulk, they are imparting their energy to that realm. I think some of those entities might be able to taste that. I think Breshopep is experimenting actively with interacting on a four-dimensional level, tinkering with space and time. Hence, the rapid aging deaths of those it passes by. I think it is becoming aware of us, at least in the widest sense of how our existence works and functions. The doctor paused here to stare Romana dead in the eyes. I think the bulk entities are playing with their food. Romana shuddered.
What will we do?
She asked. What we can in the time available. The doctor replied grimly. The two Time Lords suddenly realized Radrag was standing nearby. It seemed he had been waiting for them about halfway along the covered road, catching his breath. It was unclear how much he had heard. Breshopep is a higher dimensional being, he said simply. Warping the passage of time sounds like the most plausible explanation I've heard so far. The doctor nodded. Unfortunately so. Together they all walked back to the administration building. As they reached it, the Time Lords heard a barely audible chirp. Radrag waved his hand past the small hole in the side of his head which formed his left ear. A faint, indistinct and tinny voice could be heard, but the words were too garbled to make out. "Not another!" Radrag cried. Although his tone was as neutral as ever, his body screamed. "What's the trouble, my good friend?" the doctor asked, momentarily forgetting their respective timelines. "One of the last off-world ships is trying to take off without permission. They know the dangers, but will not listen to reason."
"We must stop them,"
Romana agreed.
"The winds could change in a second."
Radrag nodded, but the doctor pointed, saying, "Too late." The spaceport clearly lay on the right side of the city as one faced the administration building. In that direction, the distant mountain tops could be seen rising above the city walls. Between those walls and the mountains now rose a sizable craft, being borne upwards by multiple flaming engines. The ship itself was quite bulbous and asymmetric, finished in a paint scheme of yellow and white bands. It had barely cleared 4 times its own length into the sky when Breshopep appeared. This time it appeared to stride on thin air, and as it walked it climbed, tracing a diagonal path which cut right in front of the rising ship. It was impossible to tell exactly what had happened to those unknown aliens at the controls, but the effects on the ship were clear enough. One after another, the engines spluttered and died. The nose of the ship tilted slightly towards the mountains, then the craft stalled and began to fall. It sank with ever-increasing speed to disappear behind the walls. This was followed moments later by a ground-shaking explosion and a dirty orange mushroom cloud filling the air beyond the city. Slowly, the cloud expanded and was dispersed by the wind. Radrag, the doctor and Romana all looked down at their feet in grief and defeat. Finally, Romana turned to the doctor.
"Doctor, we have to find a way to help these people."
The doctor's head snapped up to regard her sternly. "What do you expect me to do? I cannot remove the wind. Do you know what a planet with no wind is? A dead planet!" Romana looked ready to argue, but at that moment could not find the words. The doctor's demeanour softened a little. "Well, you never know. Perhaps we might find some clue back at the TARDIS. Radrag, would you care to join us?" "Of course, Doctor. Any aid you can give would be gratefully received." With that, the trio took the short walk along the perimeter street until they arrived at the TARDIS. They discovered something had arrived before them. "K9!" the doctor shouted happily. "Did you find all that you were looking for?" "All scans completed, Master. All new data fully assimilated." "Excellent news, K9. Romana, can you quiz our dear Radrag here on any further details he may have omitted on this Breshopep? I'm just going to pop in with K9 to upload his findings."
"Of course, Doctor,"
Romana replied. With that, the doctor took K9 inside. About 5 minutes later, the door of the TARDIS popped open again. Round its edge peered the doctor, his face looking ashen and drawn. "I think I may have found something which might help," he said in oddly muted tones. With these words he stepped from the TARDIS. In his right hand was a disc covered in a variety of small, colourful buttons. One of these he now pressed. Instantly, a holographic globe was projected above the disc, a representation of a Quathy. This rendering in light was superimposed with figures and script, and also had some sort of additional shading over its surface ranging from green to red. "This is an advanced wind speed mapping device," the doctor explained. "It incorporates 1 or 2 of the TARDIS's time visualization circuit designs. As such, it should give you an accurate measure of where the winds will be strongest for up to 2 weeks into the future." Radrag's head darted from side to side slightly, an indication of mild confusion. "Well, yes, I can see how this would be useful, warning us as to when to stay indoors," he said slowly. The doctor shook his head. "No, Radrag, you're missing the point," the doctor said grimly. "Please explain," Radrag responded. "You have many ships now currently grounded in your spaceport, yes?" the doctor asked. Radrag nodded. "And you have many other systems with which you are in contact?" the doctor continued. Again, Radrag gave his silent confirmation. Then you must contact those worlds. Find those which are still responding. Ascertain whether they are free from any unusual apparitions or other dangers. And if they are, evacuate your people to them. Radrag stood in stunned silence for a moment. Then he inclined his head. I understand. I will do as you advise. I will use your device to see when the wind is at its lowest around Radrag and launch in those windows. The doctor held up a finger. No. You must look for when the wind is strongest over other locations on this planet. Those are the times to launch. A look of horrified realization crept over Romana's face, while Radrag shuddered. When the wind is fiercest over other settlements, I understand. The doctor nodded once, stiffly. And now, old friend, we must take our leave. The doctor said, pushing open the door of the TARDIS. Of course, Doctor. You have done all you can, and we are grateful. I look forward to our meeting again in the future. The doctor froze for a moment. I hope you're right, he said grimly. Then he entered the TARDIS. Romana looked at Radrag apologetically and shrugged awkwardly. Then she hurried after the doctor. Romana caught up with him halfway down the stairs to the main console, grabbing his arm and spinning him towards her.
What has got into you?
She cried, exasperated. A sense of urgency. The doctor replied evenly. Romana would not release her grip upon the doctor.
No! That is not enough explanation for this. We are leaving, it seems, yet we have not solved the problem. The monster remains. And all you have done to help is give the Alshin a glorified weather app and a plan to sneak away while the bulk entity is distracted consuming others.
The doctor was about to reply when Romana ploughed on once more.
And,
she said with emphasis,
why be so arch with Radrag? You know full well, as does he, that you met in your past timeline, his future. Of course you'll meet again.
The doctor stared at her for a moment. Then he simply said, Follow me. He led her down the remaining stairs to the main console. He gestured to the view screen currently showing the fragments of spacetime annotated by K9's additional data. K9 completed the updated analysis informed by his latest scans. Look at the display. Romana glanced at it, then back to the doctor.
It hardly looks changed at all. Virtually the same spots as before our visit to Aquathi. Did K9 make some sort of mistake?
The doctor shook his head. You are wrong. K9 data's eliminated almost half the source events from the screen. Look again at all the spots. Romana peered more closely at the display now, scanning her eyes across all of the points marking the source events.
I can't see any... Wait, that can't be right. Have some of them changed color? Some of them look almost...
Black. The doctor finished for her. Yes. Your eyes are not deceiving you. K9's new data did remove some of the more recent points of light. And beneath most of them, there is now an utter absence of anything. Those points are pinpricks of nothingness. The universe is no longer just dissolving from the outside in. Now it is starting to break down at the sites of some of the last interactions with our quarry. Romana turned to stare at the doctor.
By the sliders,
she gasped.
Have things already come so far?
The doctor nodded. And you wondered why I cast doubt on my meeting Radrag again? It matters not one jot if I've already met Radrag, and that meeting lies in the future. Not if the whole of space and time dissolves into nothing. When the universe goes, everything goes. All places, all events, all history. The whole of existence. As if it had never been. Romana was finally lost for words, and just clutched her forehead, struck by the enormity of it all. As to helping Radrag and his people more, we did what we could. You must see now. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. My dear Romana, quite simply, we have run out of time. Romana nodded her understanding with a pained expression. The doctor threw the launch lever.